She returned the king's lost wolf to the palace gates. He'd declared her dead. That morning in the village of Cinderfen, where the marsh fog rolled in each dawn like a second sky, the old herbalist Mauret used to say, "A thing lost in the dark was never truly gone. Only waiting for someone brave enough to hold a lantern." Sable Voss had grown up hearing those words pressed into her like a maker's mark. She had no wolf, no inner beast that stirred and answered the moon, and in a world where the shift was proof of worth, that absence had shaped her entire life. She had learned to be useful instead of valued. She had learned to move through rooms without disturbing the air. She had learned that quiet endurance is its own kind of courage, though no one ever said so. She did not know, on the morning the king of Veldrath declared her dead, that she was about to walk out of her own erasure carrying a wolf cub that was not hers, and a secret that would undo an entire court. She kept Mauret's lantern, small, iron-boned, fitted with green glass, on a hook by her door. She had never stopped lighting it at dusk. Chapter 1. The Decree at Dawn. The proclamation was read at the village gate at first light, before the market carts had even rolled their wheels through the mud. Sable heard it from the window of the apothecary where she had worked for 3 years, grinding medicines and mixing poultices for wages that barely kept her in bread and firewood. She was pressing dried yarrow when the herald's horn cut the morning, and she set down her pestle without hurry, because the proclamations from Veldrath Palace were rarely anything that touched her world. This one was different. By order of His Majesty Caspian, Alpha King of Veldrath, let it be known, the woman named Sable Voss of Cinderfen, former ward of the palace household, is hereby declared deceased. Her name shall be struck from the rolls of the living. Any who report a sighting shall be rewarded. Any who claim to be her shall be brought to the palace for judgment. So it is spoken, so let it stand. The herald rolled his scroll. The village square murmured. Sable stood very still. The yarrow dust hung in a slow gold cloud around her fingers. Former ward of the palace household. She had been that once, taken in at 12 when Mauret died, and some half-remembered obligation of the old king had placed her among the palace's lesser servants. She had ground medicines there too, and kept out of the way, and been invisible until the day the new king's steward had decided that a wolfless girl was a liability, and sent her back to Cinderfen with a coin purse and no explanation. That had been 4 years ago. She had told herself she had made peace with it. Now the king had declared her dead, and she felt something shift behind her sternum. Not grief, but a hard and clarifying anger. The kind that does not shout. The kind that makes decisions. She was still deciding what it meant when the door of the apothecary swung open, and a sound came in that she had not heard in years. The high, shredded whimper of a wolf in distress. Chapter 2. What the marsh gave up. It was not a full-grown wolf that crossed her threshold. It was a cub, barely 3 months old by the look of it, with a coat the color of winter ash, and eyes that had not yet settled into their permanent gold. One of its forelegs was wrapped in a torn piece of crimson fabric, palace livery. She recognized the border stitching, and beneath the fabric was a wound that had been badly treated. Someone had attempted a field dressing with no knowledge of what they were doing. Behind the cub, breathing hard, stood Prin, a marsh runner girl of about 15 who sometimes brought Sable wild herbs in exchange for remedies. "Found it out near the Hollowmere crossing." Prin set the cub down with great gentleness on the apothecary table. "Wandered right up to me. There were soldiers looking back along the ridge road, but they were searching the wrong side." Sable's hands were already at the dressing. "How long ago?" "An hour, maybe. It's in pain, but it trusts me well enough." "Trusts you more, though. Look." The cub had turned its enormous pale eyes on Sable, and gone still beneath her fingers, with a long, shuddering exhale, as though it had been holding itself together by will alone, and had finally found somewhere to release it. She felt the rightness of that trust like a struck bell. She had no wolf of her own. But she had always spoken the body's language. She'd had to. when she had no inner beast to offer in its place. She cleaned the wound with comfrey and silver bark oil, humming low and even, and the cub watched her throughout with those not yet golden eyes. When she finished and tied the new dressing, it pressed its massive head against her forearm and exhaled again. Prin. Sable straightened. The soldiers on the ridge, they wore palace colors, all crimson and silver. Outside, the proclamation was still buzzing through the village. She is hereby declared deceased. Sable looked at the wolf cub. She looked at the green glass lantern on its hook. Then she made her decision the way she made all of them, quietly, completely, and without going back. "I need a handcart," she said. "And your silence." Chapter 3. The Road That Shouldn't Be Walked. It was 12 miles from Cinderfen to Veldrath Palace along the King's Road, and a wolfless woman declared dead had no business walking it in broad daylight. So Sable did not walk in broad daylight. She left as the afternoon light went amber and thick. The cub settled in a nest of market sacking in the handcart, her apothecary bag slung over one shoulder, Marit's green lantern lit and hanging from the cart's rail. She had packed the lantern instinctively. It was the kind of instinct she had learned to trust. The cub slept for the first 3 miles, then woke and rode upright like a dignitary, watching the road with ancient-seeming patience. Sable talked to it as she walked, not because she expected answers, but because the talking kept her mind from spiraling into the several ways this could go wrong. She told it about Marit, about the apothecary, about the way the palace kitchens had smelled of rosemary and tallow, and how she had once spent an entire winter memorizing every herb in the palace physic garden, because the plants didn't care whether she had a wolf. At the 5-mile marker, soldiers, 2 of them, mounted, halted across the road with the efficient ease of men who expected compliance. The larger one held his torch low to see her face. Name. Senna Marsh. She offered it without blinking. The name of a plant, easy to say, easy to believe. "I'm a traveling herbalist. I've been out to the Hollowmere farms." The second soldier leaned down toward the cart, and the cub, with extraordinary timing, rolled over in its sacking and presented its belly to the night sky like a sleeping house dog. Sable did not breathe. "What's in the cart?" "My kit and a dog one of the farmers asked me to carry back to town. It's medicated and sleeping." She lifted the apothecary bag so they could see the glass bottles catching the lantern light. "I could tell you what the medicines are if you like. It takes a while." The soldier straightened. Neither of them wanted a lecture on herbalism. "Move along." She moved along. Her hands were perfectly steady on the cart rails. She was proud of that afterward, when she finally let herself feel the fear. Chapter 4. Gates. She arrived at the palace gates as the first gray of pre-dawn touched the eastern hills. Not full dark, not yet dawn, the hour that belonged to neither. The gates were closed and guards stood 6 deep in the courtyard torchlight that bled through the iron. The cub was awake and upright beside her, no longer pretending to sleep. As she stopped before the gates, something changed in the animal. It stood fully on its 3 good legs and the one still tender fourth, and it tipped back its ash-colored head and let out a sound that was not quite a howl, too young for a proper howl, but carried in it every frequency of home and found, and I am here. It was the loudest she had heard it, and the most purely itself. The guards stiffened. One of them vanished at a run. Within minutes, fewer than she expected, the inner doors opened and people spilled through. Attendants, soldiers, a woman in a healer's robe who made a sound of raw relief, and behind all of them, moving with the particular stillness of a man who did not need to push through a crowd, because the crowd moved for him, came the king. Sable had seen Caspian of Veldrath 4 years ago, when she had been a palace servant, and he had been new to his crown, distant and preoccupied with the 1,000 griefs of inheriting a kingdom. She had never been close enough to matter. She was close enough now. He was tall in the way that mountains were tall, not about dimension, but about presence. Dark hair, unbound at this hour, eyes the precise color of aged amber. He wore no crown, only a night-unlaced shirt and riding trousers, as though he'd been pacing for hours, which, looking at his face, she thought he had been. He stopped when he saw the cub. The cub, for its part, abandoned all composure and scrambled down from the cart and crossed the cobblestones to him at a three-legged gallop, making the undignified chittering sound that young wolves reserve for reunion. Caspian crouched, the king of Veldrath, sovereign of the northern territories, simply dropped to his knees on the cobblestones and gathered the cub against his chest. His face did something that Sable suspected he did not often let it do in front of people. Then he looked up at her. Chapter 5. The weight of a name. Who are you? His voice was rougher than she expected, as though it had been in use all night for things other than pleasantry. She held his gaze. The old Sable, the invisible one, would have looked at his boots and given a thin name and backed away. She had walked 12 miles in the dark with a wounded royal wolf and been declared dead that morning. She was done with being invisible. My name is Sable Voss. She watched his expression move through several rooms quickly. I believe you declared me dead this morning. The silence in the courtyard was remarkable. He rose, the cub tucked against him. In the torchlight, she could see the proclamation working through his face. Not guilt, not yet, because he was too controlled for that, but the particular tightness of a man who has been handed information that requires him to rearrange something large. Bring her inside. He didn't say it to her. He said it to his steward. The same steward, she recognized him now, older and no less officious, who had sent her away 4 years ago. The steward's face was a study in competing feelings. Inside, Caspian said again and walked. They put her in a receiving room with a fire and warm water for washing, and someone brought food without being asked, and Sable ate it because she was hungry and there was nothing to be gained from refusing to eat. While she ate, the palace's head healer came and spent 20 minutes inspecting the cub's wound with the expression of a woman who was very impressed and working hard not to show it. This dressing. The healer looked up from the cub's foreleg. The silver bark oil. How did you know to use it without burning the tissue? Ratio, Sable said. 1 part to 6 of the comfrey, not the other way. Most people get it backward. Most healers get it backward. The healer regarded her steadily. Where did you train? Cinderfen, under Marit Voss. Then here, actually, in the physic garden. For 3 years until... She stopped. Until my predecessor decided you weren't useful. The healer's voice was dry. I've heard how Steward Adric curates the household. Before Sable could respond, the door opened and the king came back. He had taken time to dress properly now. Dark coat, authority settled back over his shoulders like a second skin, but the roughness was still in his voice. Leave us. The healer left. The cub, settled near the fire, opened one eye and closed it again. Caspian sat across from her at the low table, which was itself a remarkable thing. He sat at a level with her rather than standing over her, and laced his hands together. The wolf is Fen, he said. My bonded cub. He disappeared 3 days ago from the inner courtyard. We have been searching without rest. His jaw tightened. There are people who would very much like me not to have a bonded wolf. There are people who arranged for Fen to disappear, which I will deal with separately and thoroughly. You brought him back. I found him. A marsh girl found him first, actually. You should know that. A girl named Prin from Cinderfen. He made a note of the name. She watched him do it, and that simple gesture, the noting of a marsh girl's name by a king, revised something in her estimation of him. Why did you come yourself? His amber eyes were direct. You could have sent the girl. You could have sent word. You had every reason to avoid these gates. I had declared you dead this morning, which I am going to explain, and then I am going to apologize for. I know why you declared me dead. She set her cup down. Steward Adric told your office I died of marsh fever. Because a wolfless former ward who knows your physic garden and your household routines is a loose end he couldn't account for. She had worked this out during the 3rd mile of her night walk. What I want to know is why you signed the proclamation without verifying it. The silence this time had a different texture. He did not look away from her. Because I trusted a man I should not have trusted, he said. And because I did not know your name well enough to question it. It was honest. She respected honest. I came myself, she said, because Fen needed proper care, and I was the one who knew how to give it. And because a thing lost in the dark was never truly gone, and someone needed to hold a lantern. She touched the green glass lantern she had carried in and set on the table beside her bag, without thinking. I've been holding one all my life. I wasn't going to stop now. He looked at the lantern for a long moment. Chapter 6. What Adric had done. The full accounting came out over the next 3 hours, not all of it in that receiving room, but enough. Steward Adric had indeed sent the false report of Sable's death. He had also, it emerged, arranged the theft of Fen through a network of merchants who sold rare bonded wolf cubs to the powerful for status and leverage. Fen had been worth an enormous sum to the right buyer. The proclamation of Sable's death had been preemptive. Adric knew she had knowledge of the Physic Garden's entrance, through which the theft had been arranged, and he had calculated that a wolfless former ward with no allies was easier to erase than to account for. She sat through the intelligence briefings with a kind of eerie calm, partly because she had guessed the broad strokes, and partly because Adric's logic was so perfectly constructed around the assumption that she was powerless. She had been declared dead because she was not worth being afraid of. And she had walked those 12 miles precisely because she had never let that assumption dictate her actions. Adric was taken into custody before noon. She never saw him in the corridor. She was glad. What she did see, approaching midday, was the palace Physic Garden through a window. It looked almost exactly as she remembered. The silver bark trees standing at the eastern wall, the rows of dormant winter herbs, the stone basin in the center. Almost, but not quite. It had been let run wild in places, and there was a section near the south wall that was clearly diseased and had not been pruned back. She was staring at it when Caspian appeared beside her. It hasn't had a proper keeper in 3 years, he said. Adric let 2 capable people go. I can see the blight from here. The night sage needs cutting back before it spreads to the Helen root, or you'll lose the whole south corner by spring. Would you consider staying to address it? She turned to look at him. He was standing beside her at the window, looking out at the overgrown garden, and there was nothing performative in his question. He was not offering her a charity position. He was asking her to do a thing she was genuinely the most capable person to do. What capacity? She asked. Chief Herbalist. It's a formal role. It comes with quarters, salary, and authority over the Physic Garden and the Palace Apothecary. The current title is vacant. He paused. I should have known your name 4 years ago. I did not, because my household was managed by a man who benefited from keeping certain people invisible. That is not a mistake I intend to repeat. Sable was quiet for a long moment. Outside, the winter garden waited. I'll want Prin trained as my apprentice. The marsh girl. Done. And I will need a full assessment of whatever damage Adric let accumulate before I can give you a timeline. Also done. She looked at him again, this king who had knelt on cobblestones for a cub, who had written down a marsh girl's name. There was still so much she did not know about him. But she had always been good at reading what a living thing needed. And what she read in him now was someone who had been managing a kingdom full of people who wanted pieces of it, and had not had anyone simply tell him the truth about his south garden wall in a very long time. I'll stay, she said. On those terms. Something eased around his eyes. Chapter 7. The long knowing winter moved through the palace. Sable moved with it. She was given quarters in the eastern wing, near the Physic Garden, and she hung Marette's lantern on the hook beside her door without deliberating about it. She made her assessment, submitted it in writing with careful diagrams, and began the work of restoring the garden to what it had been and beyond. Prin arrived from Cinderfen within the fortnight, wide-eyed and fiercely capable. Sable put her to work immediately on the east beds and watched her learn with the same hunger Sable had felt at 12. pressing seeds into dark palace soil. Fen recovered. His foreleg healed cleanly, which the palace healer attributed to the initial treatment, and stopped trying to be modest about. The cub had a habit, once he was mobile again, of appearing in the physic garden at unexpected hours, and sitting among the rows of herbs like a small presiding spirit. He seemed to regard Sable as a secondary human, which she took as the highest possible compliment. Where Fen went, Caspian followed, not obviously, not in the sovereign sweeping through fashion, but by a gradual and inexplicable tendency to be in the physic garden in the evenings. At first he came with questions about the restoration. Then he came with questions about the herbs. Then he came without questions and helped her tie back the climbing night bloom, which required 2 sets of hands, and resulted in more conversation than either of them planned for. She learned he had taken the throne at 24 when his father died, that he had spent 3 years feeling like a man running uphill in borrowed boots, that he had inherited not only the kingdom, but Adric and a dozen others, like him, who had managed to make him feel that their competence was his survival. She told him what it was like to be sent away at 17 with a coin purse and no explanation, and he listened the way that people listen when they are not building their response, really listened, with the whole weight of his attention. "I want to ask you something," he said one evening, the night bloom finally secured, and both of them sitting on the stone basin's edge in the last of the afternoon light. "And you do not have to answer." She waited. "Do you resent me for it?" The 4 years. Adric, the proclamation. All of it. She considered this honestly. She had spent 3 months considering it honestly. "I resent what was done," she said at last. "But I know the difference between a man who does harm and a man who fails to see harm being done. You were the second." She looked at her hands, stained green as always, as they had been since she was 12 years old. "The question is what the second kind of man does once he can see." His hand came to rest over hers on the basin's stone edge, not reaching or grasping, just present, warm, a question in its own right. She turned her palm up. Chapter 8. What the King Knew. The formal inquiry into Adric's networks took the rest of winter and well into the early thaw, and Sable was called to testify 3 times on the physic garden's layout and the theft routes, and each time she gave her account precisely and without embellishment. The court watched her with the layered attention that courts give to people who have moved unexpectedly from the periphery to the center. She did not perform for them. She had never performed. There was a night near the end of the inquiry when she found Caspian in the physic garden at a late hour, which was unusual. He was usually careful about the proprieties, and the palace gossip was already in full song about the king and the herbalist, and they had both pretended not to hear it. But there he was, sitting on the basin edge with Fen across his feet, reading something by lantern light. Her lantern, she realized. He had taken it from its hook by her door and brought it out here, and he was reading by its green-tinted light as if it were the most natural thing. She did not say anything about it. She sat beside him, and Fen shifted to lay across both their feet, and the garden breathed around them in the winter cold. "When this is finished," Caspian said without preamble, "I intend to court you, properly. In daylight." He looked up from the document. "I thought you should know in advance, so it wouldn't be a surprise." "That is a very administrative way to declare romantic intent." "I'm told I'm administrative." "You knelt on cobblestones in the dark for a wolf cub." "That's different." "It isn't, actually," she said. "That's what I'm telling you. The man who does that is the same man. All of it is the same man." She looked at him in the green light. "I don't need daylight and propriety. I'm not going anywhere." The kiss was unhurried, which was exactly right, because neither of them was in a rush anymore. Fen remained resolutely asleep across their feet throughout, which seemed about as validating as a bonded wolf could get. The court found out anyway. The court, in this case, found they could manage. In the spring, on a morning when the physic garden was coming up in the particular fierce way that things grow after a bad winter, pressing upward through the late frosts with a kind of indignant abundance, the king of Veldrath took Sable Voss as his queen consort in a ceremony in the palace's outer courtyard. She wore no veil and carried no flowers. She had her hands. She had, braided at her wrist, a cord from the night she had wound the night bloom back along the garden wall, a thin thing, green as her fingers. Fen sat at her feet throughout the ceremony and howled at the vows, which the officiator chose to interpret as auspicious. She had no wolf. She had never needed one. Epilogue. 1 year later. The saying in Cinderfen, if you ask anyone who lives there now, and people ask because Cinderfen has become known for a thing it was not known for before, is this: a thing lost in the dark was never truly gone, only waiting for someone brave enough to hold a lantern. Old Moret had said it first. The Queen had said it in the courtyard on the morning she brought Fen home. It is embroidered now on the lintel of the palace apothecary, in green thread, by Prynne, who has become a healer of real skill and a small amount of fame for a marsh runner girl who started with wild herbs and a borrowed cart. Sable, Queen Sable, though she still went by simply Sable in the garden, and sometimes in bed in the mornings, when Caspian was trying to keep her in it longer than the garden schedule permitted, made a habit every evening of taking the green glass lantern down from its hook by the door and lighting it before dark. Caspian had asked her about it once, early on. She had explained about Marit, about the habit, about the comfort of a lit thing in a dark world. He had not asked her to stop. He had instead begun to help, reaching the hook easily because he was tall, cupping the flame from the draught while she lit the match, the small shared ritual of two people who have found each other in the dark and intend to keep the light. On the first anniversary of the morning she had walked through the palace gates, with a wolf cub and a lantern and her own name. Caspian set a box on the physic garden's stone basin, her favorite thinking place, where the climbing night bloom had now woven itself so thoroughly over the wall that it was more flower than stone. Inside the box, on a bed of dark velvet, was a lantern. Not iron-boned like Marit's, but built to match it, green glass the same dimensions, made by a palace craftsman who had been given the original to measure and had asked no questions. "So there are two," the card read in Caspian's administrative handwriting. "One for each of us, in case one of us is in the dark first and needs to find the other." She looked at it for a long time, the old lantern in one hand and the new one in the other, the weight of them perfectly balanced. Fen, full-grown now and spectacular, nosed the box off the basin and sat in its place with the smug authority of a wolf who had, from the very beginning, known exactly how this story was going to end. She had been declared dead on a morning that could not contain her. She had walked 12 miles through dark marsh roads with someone else's wolf and her own lantern, and not one scrap of proof that she mattered, only the knowledge that she did. That had always been enough. It was still enough. A thing lost in the dark was never truly gone. Only waiting for someone brave enough to hold a lantern. She had been